to serve with the Federal State Land Use Commission in their Technical Resource Committee. We believe our planning will be useful in all agencies and the Congress in planning for resource and land management systems for Alaska. Now, for the purposes of discussion, it seems that the following assumptions are sound, although in some areas they may be debatable. Number one, that Alaska will eventually become a major supplier of energy and mineral resources for the nation. Two, that energy systems, primarily oil and gas, will be the main source of income for the state of Alaska. Three, that mineral development will dictate to some degree the extent and direction of energy utilization within the state. Four, the energy and mineral development will attract secondary industry. And five, that all of this will involve substantial increases in power usage and needs for new power plants and transmission lines. We think most people will agree that the needs for new power systems should be considered in the broader land and resource management systems, along with roads, pipelines, and other utilities. However, like new roads and pipelines, power plants and transmission lines tend to be controversial, which is one very good reason why land management systems are easier to talk about than they are to implement. One of our current programs is a major contribution to a revised Alaska Power Survey sponsored by the Federal Power Commission. This is a study of potential Alaska power system needs and alternatives through the year 2000, in addition to a current inventory of existing facilities. This work is being accomplished through 4 Alaska advisory committees to the FPC, with participation from the utility systems, several state and federal agencies, and representatives of the consumer and environmental groups. Points developed in the power survey work to date include such items as: 1, that statewide Alaska power requirements are growing at an average rate of around 12% per year. This means doubling the required capacity every 6 years. The current national growth rate is approximately 7% per year. This rapid growth covers a period during which, surprisingly, there was a small increase in power-using industry. The pipeline-related activities and other near-future developments indicate that this rapid increase will continue for at least the balance of this decade. 2, the present total statewide installed generating capacity is approximately 1 million kilowatts. Over 70% of this is within the rail belt area from Kenai to Fairbanks. New statewide capacity required between now and the year 2000 will be in the range of 3.2 to 10.5 million kilowatts, depending upon whether you consider the minimum or an intensive industrial development. Well, kilowatts may leave many of you unimpressed. To put it in dollars, this represents that within this time frame, between now and the year 2000, approximately $450 million of new fossil fuel type plants will need to be installed. Using the high range, it's over $2 billion worth, a sizable investment in a relatively short period of time. In terms of energy, the requirements by the year 2000 is estimated to be in the range of 15 to 38 billion kilowatt hours. Now, since Alaskans are generally becoming accustomed to thinking in terms of oil, this is equivalent to 25 to 50 million barrels of oil per year used in power generation. Nearly all recent growth has been supplied by additional oil and gas-fired generators. Between 1965 and 1972, dependency of Alaska power systems on oil and natural gas rose from 36% to 60%. The percentage will likely be 90% by the year 1980. I might mention here that the Chugach Electric Beluga reserves, according to the information I have, amounts to, is under contract for 2 billion cubic feet of gas, which is good under their program of generation development to last through 1984. They're also proposing an additional contract of another 2,000 billion cubic feet, which would extend their capability through the year 1994. In view of recent developments, we probably will be looking at cost incentives as well as resource allocation incentives to change this trend. The coal and hydro alternatives certainly are receiving a great deal of new interest. Nuclear power is probably further in the future for Alaska, and other energy sources such as geothermal and solar power will probably remain uncertain for quite some time because of the technical and economic problems. The Cook Inlet and the rail belt generally are blessed with very attractive oil, gas, and hydro resources. Most of the rest of the state is pretty well locked into diesel-fired generation with few alternatives, and consequently is facing some disturbing cost increases. Power plant and transmission line siting is certainly a critical issue. The need is for long-range, open planning, advanced designations of sites, and streamlining license and permit systems once the planning and site selections are in. The corridor studies under the Land Use Planning Commission and by the Interior Department certainly deserve input and participation from the viewpoint of future power and communication system needs. The long-range conservation discussions frequently referred to an all-electric economy as a measure of conserving fuel resources and improving urban environments. The concept may make a lot of sense for Alaska. I suppose all of the above can be wrapped up by stating the Alaska energy and power systems are vital to the future well-being of the state and the nation, and that this has to be a major consideration in land resource policies. I'll only discuss one potential hydro site because it has been in the news lately. The comprehensive changes of the national fuel situation has caused renewed thinking in terms of other sources of power system energy. In Alaska, it makes good sense that the abundant water resources should be developed where environmentally and economically feasible. to conserve this oil and gas for higher and better uses. Now, for the rail belt, there is a great deal of renewed interest in establishing a transmission grid and developing hydro power at the Devil Canyon and other units of the upper Susitna River. Also, the rail belt coal resources may prove to be a very important alternative or additional sources of energy to an interconnected system. The Alaska Congressional Delegation has recently introduced legislation authorizing construction of the Devil Canyon project. Supporting resolutions have been introduced by the state legislature and others. APA and the Corps of Engineers are working together to outline and initiate the necessary studies, including marketability, environmental impact. Public hearings will be scheduled when sufficient data is put together. Now, finally, a word about land resource management systems. There is a need to recognize that a shift from present trends will involve some major new facilities, such as extensive power and communications grids, larger generating units, power pooling, coordinated system operation and plans. All this suggests a need for a utility as well as transportation corridors. There is a need for careful preservation of long-range energy and power alternatives. There is a need to develop planning, permit, and licensing systems that assist in selecting the best alternatives and assure their timely development. There is a need for careful and objective evaluation of economic, social, and environmental implications. From the Alaska Power Administration's point of view, this is what lies ahead, both during the following and the land use, both during and following the Land Use Commission's tenure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. House. Next on the program will be Mr. Robert McGrane, who is State President of the Alaska Miners Association. Mr. McGrane is a 12-year Alaskan. He's owner of McGrane Jewelers. He is a former communications engineer. He is Vice President of the Independent Telephone Pioneers Association. Mr. McGrane.
Thank you, Dr. Harrison. I want to thank Wanda Walcott for running me down. It seems our first invitation followed Leo Mark Athley down to California. The Alaska Miners Association is composed of about 650 paid members. Anyone can join the association as long as you have an interest in some field of minerals or just a interest in the economy that these minerals could bring to Alaska. We started a new membership, which I think is very interesting. It's a student membership, and it only costs a student $2 a year in order to belong to the association. My presentation will be brief, as I'm sure our moderator, with his questions later, will cover most of the fields that I could take up your time with right now. I have been asked to look into my crystal ball and answer the question, after the Land Use Commission, what? It will take a crystal ball to answer this question. Therefore, since I usually look at the better side, I'd like to use a rosy-colored crystal ball with a dark tint. The native land claims, which created a commission, also did a number of other things. It removed 40 million acres from control of the bureaucrats in Washington and put it into private ownership by giving it to the natives. Also, the natives were given $1 billion to be paid by the federal government and the state through its mineral royalties. The Land Use Commission recommended 60 million acres for multiple use and 20 million acres for parks and other withdrawals. I do not agree with the 20 million acre withdrawal and do not believe that any land in the state should be closed to mineral use until a higher need is proven. When the commission was created and the lands withdrawn, they were supposed to be put into national parks, national forests, wildlife refuge, and wild and scenic rivers. Congress wasn't exactly fair to the National Forest Service because they only made provision for the Commission and the Secretary of Interior to report to Congress. No provision was made for the Natural Forest Service under the Secretary of Agriculture, the only department with multiple use to make independent recommendations to Congress. The Secretary of Interior, in the face of a national energy crisis and a mineral shortage, has recommended only 20 million acres for multiple use. Some that have had time to read his recommendations thoroughly claim as much as 150 million acres would be withdrawn from mineral entry. This in the light of a known mineral shortage. Now, one of our potential presidential candidates, Senator Jackson, has submitted bills supporting Secretary Morton's recommended withdrawals and added another 20 million acres requested by conservation societies. The only good for Alaska the Native Land Claims Act did was put 40 million acres into private ownership. Whether any of the Commission's recommendations will be accepted in the light of action by Congress is questionable. I believe the only way that any good can come out of their recommendations is for the Commission to open an office in Washington and pawn their recommendations into Congress every day and not by hearings once in a while. The only people interested in keeping Alaska open, it seems, are living in Alaska and cannot afford the money to go to Washington to support the Commission's recommendations. Provisions for transportation to Washington should be made by the state of Alaska, as they did when the Alaska Native were fighting for land and money. What do I see after the Land Commission? I see 105 million acres of land belonging to the state of Alaska, as called for in the Statehood Act, and 40 million acres in native hands. The other millions of acres, under the present trend of Congress, you could expect them to be put in parks, wildlife refuges, and scenic rivers. But with the present mineral shortage and our dependence on foreign supply, they will have to take a good look at their future actions. The continuing rise in the price of gold has changed the mineral picture. Where it wasn't feasible before to open some mines, you'll find the small amount of gold found with copper and other minerals may pay for production costs. Last but not least, the North Slope Road will open up a large area with many other secondary roads and possibly a railroad. Alaska does have a future in minerals as long as we don't bog it down with useless permits and regulations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McGrane. Now we will introduce an addition to our program, someone who doesn't appear here, but we thought it would be appropriate. Major Richard Merck from the Alaska Command will speak. Major Merck is new to Alaska. He came recently from Greenland. His work has been primarily with base engineering. He has a master's and a PhD in civil engineering. Major Merck.
Thank you, Dr. Harrison. I really came south for the winter was what I did. As Barney pointed out in his definition of natural resources, they include many things. They also mean many things to the different government agencies that are involved in managing them. The Department of Defense concept of natural resource management includes the land and the vegetation and the wildlife on that land. The use of the land is viewed under a multiple use concept within the constraints imposed by environmental considerations and also our military mission. This discussion will include just what land we do have in Alaska, the management policy for that land use, including the environmental and the wildlife considerations. Military lands in Alaska are controlled by 3 different agencies. The Alaskan Command has approximately 1,765,000 acres. Aerospace Defense Command has about 50,000 acres, and the Navy, mostly in Petroleum District 4, has about 23 million acres. Totally, the lands controlled by the military are about 6.6% of the Alaskan lands. If you take out Pet 4, they're about half of 1% of the Alaskan lands. In addition to the use of these lands, we do conduct maneuvers on lands that we do not own. The purpose of these off-base maneuvers is to achieve a familiarity with the operations on all land types in the Arctic, and also to train with the National Guard components in their home areas. Our land management policy in Alaskan Command has several key points. First, our land holdings are kept to an absolute minimum, consistent with our needs. This policy has resulted in accessing of approximately 840,000 acres since 1970. In addition, Air Defense Command is now in the process of accessing approximately 29,000 acres of the 50,000 acres it holds. A second point in our land management policy is that training is conducted on the military land when possible. Thirdly, when training on off-base lands, an environmental assessment is prepared for the proposed training. Upon completion of the training, cleanup operations are performed to restore the land to its original condition. Most of these training exercises off-base involve rather small units and helicopters, so there's very little impact or lasting impact on the land. Permission to use the off-base lands is obtained by the District Office of the Corps of Engineers through the cooperation of the Bureau of Land Management, the State of Alaska, Forest Service, the local governments, and the different native corporations, depending on who owns or controls the land. Environmental considerations in our resources management effort are not confined to the off-base lands alone. We are constrained to be within the standards set by the Environmental Protection Agency, and this is on our own lands. This requirement has led to projects for sewage treatment plants at all the remote bases in Alaska and for hooking the large main bases into the local sewage systems. Air pollution was a consideration along with the cost for converting the Anchorage area bases to natural gas from coal on the heating and power plants. We have installed or are installing incinerators to take care of the solid waste at all of the off-base remote sites. The Alaskan Air Command has a project to crush and stack approximately 320,000 old oil drums. They're also looking for a buyer for these oil drums, but unfortunately to this point they haven't been able to collect enough in any one point so that they can make it attractive for a salvage contractor to bid on them. Now, environmental assessments and, when necessary, environmental impact statements are prepared for our construction projects. A major portion of the Department of Defense Natural Resources Management Program includes the wildlife program. The February-March issue of the National Wildlife Magazine carried an article on the success, Department of Defense-wide, of the military wildlife management program. However, we have not been able to find the herd of caribou that they mentioned was grazing contentedly on Fort Richardson. We assume they mean the moose, of which there are approximately 650 on the Fort Richardson-Elmendorf complex at this time. The ELCOM Wildlife Management Program is based on cooperation with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game and the Department of Interior's Bureau of Sport Fisheries and Wildlife. Our management program includes trained wildlife agents at each base who assist in the management of fish and wildlife, and they perform limited enforcement activities. Two projects of particular local significance are the moose tagging program and the fish rearing projects at Fort Richardson and Elmendorf. The moose tagging program is aimed at determining the migration patterns of the moose wintering on Fort Rich. This program is accomplished with the cooperation of the State Fish and Game Department. The cooling pond at Fort Rich Power Plant is the site of a joint military state-operated fish rearing facility. The fish rearing facility uses the water from Ship Creek, which has been warmed while used as the coolant for the turbines of the Fort Richardson Heating and Power Plant. This warmed water is mixed with cold water from the stream to maintain a constant year-round 55 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the ideal temperature for the fish of the salmon and trout family. In 1971, the State Fish and Game Department spent $300,000 in improvements of the capacity and the temperature control of this facility. Last year, they spent approximately $75,000 in this operation, and during '73, grew about 1.25 million fish there. In 1974, they expect to grow approximately 1.5 million fish there. They are also planning a project which would extend this program to the Elmendorf power plant and the cooling ponds there. Future Alaskan Command actions concerning management of natural resources will include increased attention to actual and potential oil and mineral resources, annual review of military land use, and continuing cooperation with land and game management officials of other agencies. Some previous military publications specifically excluded minerals, oil, and gas from the definition of natural resources. As I mentioned initially, the military defines natural resources in terms of land, the vegetation, and wildlife on that land. Recently, however, the Department of Defense has called for a one-time report on the actual existence of potential availability of energy and other mineral resources on DoD, Department of Defense controlled lands. The information was requested for the House Armed Services Committee, and no doubt reflects a concern for the future sources of raw materials. This is Mr. Belisco's first step in his program, is first find out what you have in terms of mineral deposits. Our present regulations require us to perform an annual review of the lands we are using to ensure that we still need these lands. However, of course, a new Department of Defense concept or system could mean that we would actually need more lands in the future. Continuing cooperation with all other government landowners and managers from the federal to the individual level is essential to our training needs. In addition, the continuing cooperation with the fish and game management officials will be of prime benefit to the military and also the state of Alaska. We hope the cooperation will be as good as that we have enjoyed in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Major. Since Major Merck is new to the state, I'll rule out of order any questions on the Blair Lakes bombing range. Next, on our
Thank you, Dr. Harrison. Fellow panel members, ladies and gentlemen. The Alaska Oil and Gas Association, to give you an idea of who we are and what we are, is made up of about 26 oil and gas operators that have interests within the state of Alaska. We are a public information source, we are a lobbying source, and we are engaged in various support of various scientific endeavors throughout the state. Their primary interest is in the North Arctic at the present time. Oil and gas is a newcomer to the state of Alaska. We all know that. This is wrong. First oil and gas exploration was accomplished in the state of Alaska in the late 1890s, where a well was drilled in the Niskin Peninsula. In 1903, the first commercial oil well was drilled in Catala, and initial oil was sold to the community of Cordova. This oil field remained in operation until approximately 1933, when a small refinery that had been built burned, and it was not economically feasible to reconstruct the refinery. That was the first phase of the oil industry. The second phase started with federal oil and gas leases in what is now known as the Kenai Moose Range on the Kenai Peninsula. And the first discovery of what we would, in modern day terms, say commercial oil and gas was found in 1957 by Atlantic Richfield. This first discovery is now known as the Swanson River Field. From there, exploration moved offshore into the Cook Inlet, where in 1954 through approximately 1964 through 1966, several major offshore oil fields were discovered in the Cook Inlet. Our interest turned, or the interest of the state, people turned to the North Slope in 1968, when Atlantic Richfield announced the discovery of the Prudhoe Bay well, which was followed in September of 1969 by the now famous oil lease sale in the Prudhoe Bay area. We are currently facing, as we all know, a very critical energy period in this country and throughout the world. That's not to say that there's a critical shortage of crude oil in the world, because this is not true. But there is a critical supply shortage with the Arab embargo, restricting the export of Arab oil to Europe, to Japan, and the United States. We in this country are very, very fortunate from the standpoint that we have maintained a relatively healthy domestic oil industry. We have still been exploring throughout the United States for and finding additional reserves. Our biggest problem is that we have not been able to find enough reserves to replace those that we are withdrawing and consuming on an annual basis. This is why the oil embargo is hurt. We became more and more dependent upon oil from foreign sources, and that which was once characterized as cheap foreign oil has all of a sudden become very expensive foreign oil. Let's take a short look at the timing between the exploration phase, the first discovery of an oil field in Alaska, and moving that first barrel of crude oil to the market. As I said, the Swanson River discovery was made in 1957. The first oil went to the market 4 years later, in 1961. The subsequent oil and gas fields in the Cook Inlet took approximately 3 years from the initial discovery to the first product moving, or the first crude oil moving to market. Then we look at the North Slope, Prudhoe Bay, discovered in 1968, may get to market in 1977. That's 9 years. So the exploration for and the development of oil and gas as an energy is not an immediate thing. The exploration work we do today may pay off 10 years hence. Let's take a look at why we as an industry do, what we do, and where we do it. The first thing is that the good Lord placed the oil in the ground in certain areas. We're charged with the responsibility to find those areas. The initial step is to find sedimentary basins, basins where rocks were laid down by sedimentation. You don't look for oil in the volcanic areas. It's just not there. These sedimentary basins are found through several methods and evaluated in a very rudimentary fashion through the use of magnetic surveys, gravity surveys, which are generally followed very rapidly by on-the-ground geological surveys, where we send field parties out to test the rocks to see, are there reservoir rock characteristics? Are there source rocks characteristics? And fourth, and probably last, is to search for an entrapping mechanism within this sedimentary basin. An area where the oil and gas, which migrates through the subsurface, can be entrapped. This is generally done through geophysical methods. Sending a seismic crew into the field, stimulating a vibration, whether it be by the detonation of dynamite or various vibrating tools, and recording on various recording instruments the reflection of the shock wave. This gives us a very rough picture of what the subsurface looks like. What does this all really mean insofar as land use planning is concerned? I think the key to it is that those areas that are potential must be available for exploration. They can be made available through rules and regulations that are realistically developed by those who are in control of the area, whether it be the federal government, the state government, native regional corporations, or an individual landowner. We point with pride with our development of the Swanson River oil field in the Kenai Moose Range. This range is being overseen by members of the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they're doing an excellent job. And our operations there have not detracted from the moose population, but we understand has increased substantially the moose population in the area. All right, looking at the state of Alaska with its roughly 375 million acres, where are the possible places to find oil and gas? Well, obviously we know the Cook Inlet Basin is a good place to find oil and gas because we've already found it there. Conversely, the North Slope is a good place to find oil and gas because we found it there also. We've worked in the Copper River area. To date, we've barely scratched the surface. We've found no commercial oil and gas. The Bristol Bay area is a potential area for the accumulation of oil and gas. The Gulf of Alaska is a potential area. The Yukon-Kandick Basin, the Bethel Basin, the several basins that lie within the state of Alaska. When you look at oil and gas development, you see a utilization of land. In the primary stage, when the geologist goes out, it's much like a trapper walking on the surface, a hunter walking on the surface. They sample the rocks by the use of helicopters. As we progress into the geophysical portion of our exploration of a basin, we utilize more land. Trees, by necessity, have to be cut in paths so the geophysical lines can be laid out. The next step, of course, is the installation of a drilling rig. This can be done in many ways. On the North Slope, many of the rigs were flown in by large aircraft. In the area of the Cook Inlet, most rigs are driven in over roads, or in the wintertime over ice roads. So ingress and egress are extremely important to the oil industry in the exploration phase. If we're successful in the exploration phase, and our ratio of success is not too good, it's approximately 1 out of 50, then we move in with permanent facilities. And these are not the facilities of the old Signal Hill where rig was standing on rig upon rig. Or in Spindletop, where the same situation occurred. The development today is generally isolated to drilling pads, much like the platforms you see in the inlet, where the wells are directionally drilled from a centralized surface location and bottomed as much as 1.5 miles to 2 miles away from the surface location. These surface facilities must be connected by road, ingress and egress again. But you're talking about a pad that's maybe 300 feet wide, 400 feet to 1,000 feet long. Take, for example, a platform in the inlet. You're talking about roughly 120 feet square. Granted, they're 3-story and sometimes 4-story to handle the facilities. All right, so we found and we have developed an oil and gas field. What's the next step? we've got to move that oil to market. This will take some means of transportation, whether it be a pipeline, be a ship, be a train, or a combination of several of these. So, again, ingress and egress from the field to the market is extremely important. I feel that this can be done, as I said earlier, by realistic rules and regulations established by those that own and control the land, and in direct concert with a land use planning commission. I would like to see this group continue on as an advisory group. We in the industry, or we as an industry, have just scratched the surface of the state of Alaska. There probably is an estimated 11 billion barrels of oil that have been discovered, recoverable reserves, both in the Cook Inlet and North Slope. But there have been estimates of in excess of 100 billion barrels of oil lying within and under the state of Alaska, uplands and on the continental shelf. These reserves of oil and gas are what are needed for our country to be totally self-sufficient insofar as oil and gas energy is concerned. And I think it can be. We have been deterred, barred from development in areas where oil and gas potential lies because of many factors. Political, primarily. Land ownership, the federal government, since 1966 has been locked up. Probably rightfully so. But we're seeing a land ownership pattern develop now where we can begin to get back to work to find the oil and gas reserves that are so desperately needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. And unless an AFN representative joined us, or a state of Alaska, any of the panel members, any comments, observations you'd like to make, which we may respond to? Yeah.
I'd like to make some, since AFN is not here, I'd like to make a few observations. I'm Charlie Edwardsen, Jr., the former executive director of the Arctic Slope and Eskimo Incorporated. In Alaska, we have had a substantial history of superimposed management and administrative mechanisms which has been so disastrous. Like when we examine our fisheries is a classic example. On Kodiak, Bristol Bay, and the easy access of these U.S. corporations robbing the natural right of a citizen in state of Alaska for a few shekels of dollars. And then they give us a program that cannot, they give us an administrative program with Band-Aids. And this failure is so pronounced today. And although that under the Alaska Native Land Claims Settlement Act, everybody in state of Alaska and every native have been land use planning. Under the authority of the act, there is a higher pressing need for the state of Alaska and the native community and the federal government which is about to expire next year. And we've got 9 months left, and so everybody in state of Alaska has been so impressed by Land Use Planning Commission and what it ought to have been doing. And also at the same time that there is a national resource decay that is so visible in our fisheries. And then I would like to read a portion of the act and address these agency heads or representatives of the United States government. What leeways have been made to execute their fiduciary responsibility of protecting and analyzing all of our natural resources, which the 2C study calls for. And that this study of all federal programs primarily designed to benefit Native people and to report back to Congress for recommendation for future management and operations of these programs in 3 years. And they are still the fiduciary agents of whatever natural resource that they have mismanaged so well. And I would like to leave with that. And what type of assurance are we going to get from new forms of proper management, which is going to articulate an ecological cognizance of our resources to the direct beneficiary of Alaskan citizens, period. Thank you.
For those of you who didn't get the reference to the 2C studies, Section 2C of the Land Claims Act requires that all federal agencies within 3 years conduct a study surveying these all programs having to do with Alaska Natives. This was put into the bill. Some skeptics thought as a termination clause. Whether or not that's the intention or the effect, we're waiting to see. There is only now a 2C study underway, and as far as I know, it doesn't have any representatives from any natural resource management organizations. Now, I may be mistaken. Would any of you like to comment on this 2C business?
Charlie, Mr. Kubley, who is the agriculture coordinator for Alaska. And of course, we work very closely with Wally, and he's been keeping me informed here. He says it hasn't got it off to a very fast start, that they're going to have to get moving. I realize this. And this was one of the things I was speaking to today, is that here is a program that isn't necessarily a native-oriented program, but it is a private, state and private program that is being used throughout the whole United States. And I think it will fit, or would fit into the very thing you're talking about, is that maybe some of the programs that are in existence today don't quite fit the private land situation that's coming up. But there are programs in existence that point and direct themselves right to land use planning and management that can be directed at the private individual and the state, and it can be coordinated, and there are bucks involved. The state and private program in the U.S. with the research program represents $100 million in the U.S. Forest Service. What's Alaska's part of it? It's pretty small now. But the potential is here for an excellent program.
Any more questions on this or any other topic? Mr. Klein?
Some of the panelists, with particularly reference to energy resources, but also mineral resources, suggested that there's really a pressing need nationally for these resources in Alaska, and that somehow we have an obligation to develop these resources to meet some national needs. At the same time, we've heard previously, not just in the panel, but resources in Alaska.
I have a question that I'd like to ask to address to Mr. Blaskow and Mr. Koster. Both of you made reference to the need for increased cooperation between state and government in the future. I'm wondering if there's much hope for this in view of what I understand to be the process that we went through with the Land Use Planning Commission. That is, the agencies prepared their D2 recommendations to Interior without any cooperation with the Land Use Planning Commission, and that the commission was forced to operate without any knowledge of what the agencies were doing. Yeah.
Yes, I can respond to that as far as from the standpoint of the Forest Service is concerned. We have cooperated very closely with the Planning Commission. As a matter of fact, sometimes I think we were so close I wish we would go away. We use their resource information almost totally in preparing our proposal to present to the Secretary of Interior. We published a proposal, it will be 3 years ago, this coming July, that pointed out the multiple use lands within the D2 and D1 lands in this state and distributed to the Planning Commission. This report included their input. They have been kept informed, and they have kept us informed almost from the beginning as far as the multiple use potentials of these lands. There was a period during this last summer when the task force, the Interior Task Force, was considering these proposals that there was not an interchange between the agencies and the commission. But this was a very, very short period. So I can say from the standpoint of agriculture and the Forest Service that we've tried to get just as close as we can.
Basically, what Barney said is true. I'd like to expand upon one little point. We utilize that's the Bureau of Mines, utilize the Land Use Planning Commission as more or less of a clearinghouse. This is what we were instructed to do. There were all these different agencies who were instructed to make land use plans, and not knowing where to go after the information, it was best to have a central place where they could get this information. So the information that we developed, we submitted to the Land Use Planning Commission, and basically it was used through them. However, I have one thing that I might throw out here that is a bone of contention with some of us, is that not all of the agencies knew that this information was available, and they struck out on their own to develop their own types of information. And some of the information that they developed was erroneous, and it was erroneous through omissions. And when I mentioned that there should be more cooperation between the federal agencies, if you write a land use plan, if Barney writes a land use plan, he's going to, he doesn't have the expertise, the particular expertise that he does need, say, for a mineral resource, because his people aren't working in this particular thing every day. So we feel that there should be more cooperation, even though the Land Use Planning Commission was used as a clearinghouse. the other agencies should have been aware that this information, the basic information, the detailed information, had to be developed somewhere, and this is where we feel we could have played a greater part.
Now, there was a discrepancy, though, between the recommendations that the commissions made and the recommendations which Morton made. Now, presumably, did Morton alter agency recommendations to him, or that came to him, or what accounts for the discrepancy?
Well, I don't think that I'm qualified to speak for Morton's thinking in his recommendations.
I don't think that Morton was required to make the commission's recommendation. He was asked to make his own recommendation.
There's a Park Service man in the audience.
Yeah, one basic difference was the commission looked at resources from a total point of view. We had to look at it from the agency's administrative point of view. The two couldn't come together.
I think that there was another major discrepancy because of the internal Alaskan task force in the Department of the Interior and the State and Federal Land Use Planning Commission going and asserting themselves on two separate trips. And so one of the nice chaotic example of these two separate trips is our coloring book up here.
Any other comments on anything? Yes, Walt?
That's what came up earlier on the role of cooperation is something that needs to be nurtured continuously. As we have found in our dealings with, in particular, the State Fish and Game Department, that there is a very close working relationship here, in that they manage the game and we manage the habitat, but you can't manage the two separately. And we have found in many areas that we have drawn up cooperative agreements where there are particularly sensitive wildlife values involved. The Copper River Flats near Segovia, almost 350,000 acres, is an example where there's a tri-party agreement between the Forest Service, the Department of Fish and Game, and the State Division of Land. And in this case, before any of the parties to this agreement do anything on this land, there is consultation and agreement because of the sensitive waterfowl values here. The same thing has been done in the Stickeen as well as over on the Kickaloon Flats across from Anchorage. Of course, our cooperation goes beyond this into the state and private forestry. For instance, we work very closely with the state forester and have cooperative and cost-sharing programs here as well. The same thing goes with our research on both in Juneau and Fairbanks. And I think these are excellent beginnings in cooperative work in the state, and I think there's an excellent chance to expand on these and let them grow.
Tomorrow's session will relate to philosophies of management. Dr. Arlen Tissing will chair it. See you then.